Okay. Um, there might have been a little bit, tiny bit of confusion this past week because of what was posted, kind of was ambiguous, but we are talking this week about how do I do descendancy research on FamilySearch. And it's going to be a little bit personalized as to how I do it, but it's generally, I would think that most of the things that I do are applicable. It also depends pretty heavily on how far back on your tree you go. Obviously, if you start doing descendants with your grandparents, you may run out of people rather quickly. But as you go back, the numbers increase dramatically. So the further back you go and the further back you start, it's more likely that you'll find some very, very interesting and let's just say an overwhelming amount of individuals to work with. This kind of answers, by the way, the old statement that I've heard for so many years from people, and that their quote genealogy is all done, quote. I don't ever see that ever happening in this lifetime or in the lifetimes of anybody that I'm personally related with. So I would just guess that it's a long process here. And looking at the descendants of your ancestors is very rewarding. Okay, so we'll get going here. And first of all, I'm gonna ask that you do not fall into the fan chart trap. This is a 10-generation fan chart generated on MyHeritage. And you can see there's just abundant numbers of blanks and pluses out there, people that could be added to this lovely fan chart. If you obsess on a fan chart like this, the results of that obsession will be very simple. You'll spend a whole lot of time looking for one or two people and not actually making much progress. The production of this may be different for you. If you're starting out and you are at ground zero, a fan chart is a good way to keep track of the direct lines of your direct lines, because that gives you a real fast graphic view of all your direct lines out there, and then you can click on one and look into that individual. But the other part of the trap is jumping from where you are, or where the person you're showing as number one is, out to the blank, with making the assumption that all of the links between you and that person are valid and defensible. Let's say that they that they've been sourced, that they have adequate sourcing, and that they can be established. So what happens basically is when you get out to pick one of those plus signs out there, for example, in my case, what's going to happen is that's the product of over 100 years of people doing research, and they haven't been able to find those people. So it's pretty, even though there are a lot more available records today, some of those, in my case, for example, most of the ones that are solvable by our current record system, without doing some extensive on-site research in some locations around the world, have been solved. Every one of the, let's say, end-of-line people that I had a few years ago, 40 years ago, have now been resolved, at least by one generation, and some by more than one generation. So it's doable, but it's very, very difficult, and you should be very careful to evaluate who you decide to take as your beginning person from that kind of situation. this is the basic rule, and I'll repeat it more than once during this presentation. Every generational step, that means every time you go from a child to a parent, needs to have a verified, substantiated, reasonable source supported source-supported parent-child relationship. So what we're looking for here is, there are a lot of records. In other words, you can have census records for the family, you can have birth, death, and marriage records, and you can have all sorts of death records, and you can have everything that about a family in a lot of cases, and never have a record that actually shows who their parents are. And so that's the realistic thing. And I don't say this lightly, because I just spent the last hour or two today going through a family where I was trying to determine if there were any parent-child relationship records. And as it turned out, they were pretty thin, but it was substantiated after quite a bit of research and quite a bit of looking at the members of the family. So here in this case, for example, when we'd be looking for is the next generation. In other words, who is Thomas Parkinson's father? And if we do that, we get James Parkinson, and we have a record. And this, I didn't put the whole record in here, but this shows that his children were, one of whom was Thomas Parkinson. You'll see there's a qualification over there. It says implied. Well, implied means that it showed up in the 1841 census, and from the English standpoint, it's only implied because that's what it's listed. We would basically be more inclined to accept the census record filled out in 1841 by James Parkinson than we would want to doubt that relationship. Obviously, we're not going to stop with looking for additional records. We'll certainly want to find baptismal records in England here for each of these children, which we have done. And so we're fairly certain that we have the ancestors, the parents of Thomas Parkinson and his siblings, and James Parkinson. But when we get to James Parkinson, it gets a little more difficult, and the connection is not quite as complete and quite as reasonably established. So when you do come to that entry, okay, so let's say you start with yourself and you look on your records and you see that you have a birth record, and in some cases a DNA record that shows you that your parents are your parents. Well, that's fine. As I mentioned with the kind of the aside here with the DNA, many people are finding out across the world when they take a DNA test that their parents aren't their parents, that they have some birth parents who are not their custodial parents, the parents who raised them. It is particularly true, obviously, with those who are adopted, but many people did not know they were adopted, and DNA has also shown that to be the case. So there's a little bit of a twist here, but each time you come to that entry, obviously, even if you take a DNA test and you came to the conclusion that your biological parents were not your parents, and you identified your biological parents, they then become the end of the line. That does not mean that the end of the line is not doable or that you couldn't find more of your ancestors on that line. But what it does mean is that beyond that, there's nothing but speculation or fantasy. The same thing happens on every line on your pedigree, every single line. If you're careful and you go through each of the people named on your pedigree, your direct line ancestors, and go back and look at every source that you have for that direct line ancestor, inevitably you will find a direct line ancestor, even if one of the websites like FamilySearch or Ancestry or whatever seems to have people going back forever, you'll find a record that says that that person is not, does not have a validated parent. And so you're dead. That's the end of the line. That's the end of the line, regardless of how much more information there might be out there. So that becomes your focus if you want to establish that person and go beyond that person, is to look at that to find a parent-child relationship. I actually find a record that shows that William Smith is the father of George Smith, and that that is the date that it happened. And you may have to look at a lot of records in order to establish that. So this is kind of the way that the overall works on establishing a pedigree. Well, once you get to that point, you have a choice. You can keep looking for the next record, a next generation, or you can turn around and start looking at all the descendants of that person. You can pick anybody in your ancestry, like I mentioned, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, and you can choose any of those people for to look for descendants. Many people do this for the purpose of establishing, for example, a surname book. They will go back to one of their ancestors who, for whatever reason, because they're the first person that got to Kentucky, or because they're the first person who came to America, or the first person, whatever. And they choose that person and then do the descendancy from that person. And then they write a book, and they show all the people that are descendants of that person. Those are called surname books, basically, as a generic term. And there are thousands and thousands, and probably tens of thousands of those books, and you can find them online. They're almost, if you happen to tie into one and it's well documented and turns out to be well researched, you basically have a wonderful source to give you an assistance in finding the next generation up, because at least as far back as the person they named. What I have found with those books, however, is that generally speaking, there are many kind of speculative things where they talk about the name, the surname goes back to some royalty person in England, and the surname is common in England or uncommon or whatever. And those just are not helpful. They do not establish parent-child relationships. And so any of those statements about connections with royalty or whatever are simply there to sell the books, in my opinion. But that's just me, myself saying that. Okay, so the number of available and pertinent records decreases over time. This is something you have to get in mind, that if you start working at, if you start looking going up, going back in time, and you get to the 1800s, you have just millions of available records. If you go back in time to the 1700s, that's when that curve starts to drop pretty dramatically. And by the 1600s, it's kind of skating along the bottom. There may be records and there may not be records at all. And but if you break through the barrier of the 1600s into the 1500s, you're really getting into the Middle Ages, and you're getting into area where records were not generally kept. And almost all of the major series of records, like parish registers in England, end in the 1500s. And so what we have is this declining curve of records. On the other hand, when we look at the number of people, as you do descendancy research and go closer to the present, not only do the number of records increase dramatically as you get back into the 1800s or into up closer, even closer to the present, then you're likely to find that you have a lot more descendants than you will ancestors. In other words, you'll have relatives, people who are related to you, but they'll be like second cousin, 3 generations removed, fourth cousin, fifth cousin, 10 generations removed, anything like that. In other words, they'll be into that category rather than people who are, as you would consider, usually considered to be closely related or related to you and your family. So this whole idea here assumes that you are able to go back a number of generations, and the kind of the goal for most generational research, beginning goal, is 4 generations, that you go back to you do yourself, your parents, your grandparents, and your great-grandparents, and that gives you 8 great-grandparents. And then if you go to the next, of course, it's 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, all that. And they increase dramatically. And you can see then that as the descendants are in there, that those descendants are going to be a lot more than just a single couple that you begin the descendancy for. Their numbers are going to go up even faster, because it's going to be the total number of children and the total number of children's children. And so you'll get into perhaps hundreds, if not thousands, of names. And you need to take your time and pick those lines that you feel will be, in a sense, productive in finding people. So depending on your goal, let's suppose that you're in your reason why you are doing your genealogy is because you're interested in seeing whether or not that family tradition that you're related from the Mayflower passengers, or that you're related to royalty in England, or that your family was related to some wealthy or prominent person in the past. And if that's your relationship, if that's your motivation, then the whole idea of descendancy research probably doesn't help, because why do you want to know whether you're related to all these other people that perhaps weren't prominent or weren't royalty or any of that nature? The advantage of doing descendancy research is that when you get to the let's call it dead end brick walls of everybody in your tree, you've gotten to the point where every line you're on is simply gotten to a almost impossible, for you, almost impossible resolution. Well, if you want to do genealogy and you enjoy doing genealogy, then you'll turn around and come back down the lines. That's simple. And from the standpoint of someone who is working on the FamilySearch family tree, if your goal is to help fill in the family tree, then you're probably like me and many of the people that I associate with and talk to on a more frequent basis. And we are all interested in simply adding more names and accumulating and creating a universal family tree with substantiated sourced people for people to work with. Okay, so that kind of pushes us along a little bit. And emphasize this, the same rule applies to moving down or coming down generations towards the present as it is going back. You must find records showing this parent-child relationship. And the only thing I can say about it is it just becomes progressively more easier to do. And with the major websites that we have today, if you include all of those websites in your repertoire of searching, you will find that you'll get record hints. Once you get into the 1800s, you will start to get record hints from all of the websites, from FamilySearch, Ancestry, Find My Past, and MyHeritage. Find My Past, depending on whether you have ancestors who live in Great Britain. MyHeritage, to some extent, if you have ancestors in Europe, and Ancestry and FamilySearch, kind of generally around the world. But if you were going to start to go to non-European countries, then FamilySearch is easily the best place to do research, because they have generally they are in the process of not only adding, but generally have already accumulated a lot of records from all different places around the world. Okay, so make sure the person you start with is well documented with sources that actually apply to that person. There may be a lot of, for instance, here in this list that's on the screen here, you'll see a name that says Thomas Chattel in an entry for ELIZ, Elizabeth, or Eliza Chattel. Thomas Chattel, an entry for Elizabeth Chattel. That is not a record for Thomas Chattel. That is a record for Elizabeth Chattel, and it's a birth record. But that establishes the parent-child relationship with Elizabeth, but does nothing to establish Thomas Chattel's relationship with anyone. So everyone where you say Thomas Chattel in entry 4, that simply is saying that you've got a child's record, and in this list, you find no records for Thomas Chattel at all individually. They're all records for his children. So this works really well for descendancy research, as I mentioned, but it doesn't do you much good if you're trying to move back from Thomas Chattel. And with this list, you can see that it would be a lot more productive to start down this particular line as far as finding additional relatives than it would be to go up the line. Sorry, went backwards. So my suggestion is that you start with a person who was born in the mid to late 1700s or earlier. And if you can document that person, if that person is well documented and has and you are able to find out when they got married and what the names of their children are. But if you have someone who was, if you're going back any further than that, you really are going to start to have some problems, as the same problems finding the children's information as you had finding that person's information in the first place. So mid to late 1700s is probably the best. Earlier is possible. You can do that on occasion. But here's the reality of it. If for example, if you're focusing more on, say, the people in the United States, in America and Canada, North and South America, places in Europe, basically by the early part of the 1800s, all of the records start to be kept in all of those countries. And so what happens is by the mid 1800s, most of the countries in Europe and many of the countries in South America have begun keeping civil registration records, which are they carry birth, marriage, and death records. And then the churches have been carrying those records for baptisms, marriages, and burials. So what you have is a choice to make. And once you feel like you're very comfortable with a person like David Shepard here, and you start down on doing his descendants, then you find out how broad this can be and how more. Now, his wife may have more references. In other words, we may be able to determine that Diademia Hopkins' parents are well documented, and so we could, and her siblings, and so we may be able to go down the Hopkins line. So you have a lot of choices here as you look down and see all these people across the number with the dates here. These are all really good, solid people dates to begin to work with. Okay, now it helps if you know something about the person's life. If you just go back and you pick it up that this person is just a name on your family group record, and you have a bunch of children named, and you have maybe one record for each person, that is not a good place to start, because you may or may not have the right list of children, and you're probably still going to be benefiting mankind in general by doing research for people you're not related to. But on the other hand, you may find the contrary. Now, here's an interesting thing that happens as you do descendancy research. You suddenly find on the programs, because most of the programs now, including the large programs like Ancestry and FamilySearch and MyHeritage, which and Find My Past, will show you your relationship to that person. And so as you're going through, you can keep checking to see what is, view my relationship, see how I'm really related, if I'm still related to these people. And then you'll find that there's a spouse of a relative who you're not related to. It'll say, you're not related to that person. Here's what I suggest: looking at that, finding that person's, the spouse's parents. That's helpful. And then when you click on the parents, you'll find out all of a sudden you're related to that whole line. It's because people marry cousins, and you're going to start to see, doing your descendancy research is when you start to see all of these cousin lines coming together, and that these people are all cousins and related to you. And it can be a little bit unsettling, but that's the way it all works. So one thing important about FamilySearch, and also you can do this on Ancestry, is to view the person's tree. That's this mark right here. Now, what that does is it will take David Shepherd, this person, 1750 to 1832, and you note that I have a note there on David Shepherd that says there's no parent-child record showing who David Shepherd's parents were. And so this is really kind of an end-of-the-line person. And now when you go here, oh, and by the way, you may find that people will put in a parent for this person without showing that there's actually that relationship. They'll just pick someone named Shepherd someplace in New England at about that time, and assume that because they're named Shepherd, that this is David Shepherd's parents. But I can assure you that on this particular one, that extensive research done by professional genealogists in the past and by our family in the present has not turned up any parents for David Shepherd. We're not even sure that was his name properly, but if that's whatever. But this is what we've got to go with. So now we can look at his tree. So that puts David Shepherd with his children, and then shows his ancestors. And you can see here that the Hopkins line does go back quite a bit further. How valid this Hopkins line is another question. You realize as I'm going back in time, the number of my ancestors doubles, and that gives me that much more work to do to establish each one of the 1,024 great grandparents that I have back at that level. And so all of those may not have been equally as well researched, at least by me personally. Hopefully, when I get into this kind of a situation, there are other people who are trying to do good research and support all of the names by sources. And so I can rely on some other people to help with the work here. So now you can switch from landscape on FamilySearch to a descendancy chart. So that gives you a list, and this would be David Shepherd's descendants, his children. And this is their first generation, which happens also to be the second generation. So when you click from 1 to 2, you won't see too much of a change at all, if any. And then you can click on the generations here and see the 3 three generations of descendants and 4 generations of descendants. Now, depending on how much research has been done on this particular person's descendants, or how many different people from different lines have tied into this person over the years, so that other descendants of all of the children there have had people working on their lines. So you may find out that many of these people, the numbers by the 4th generation may run into the hundreds, and if not into higher numbers of people who are descendants. It could go into the thousands of people who are descendants of this particular person, because of the date of 1750 as his birth date and his death date in 1832. But you'll see something else that's really important about this when you look at the descendancy carefully. You'll see that although David Shepherd was born in 1750 and died in 1832, his wife also died in 1832, but his children begin dying in 1859, 1877, 1882, et cetera, 77, 84, 83, all around the same time, actually. But what does that mean? Well, this is the US Census. And if you were in another country, it would mean that's country's census records. And by 1850, we have complete family records on the US Census. So the census, rather than just showing an individual name, began showing of complete families. So you take the next person down in the line, Wade Hopkins Shepherd, and he died in 1859. So he and his family would probably show up in the 1859 census, and so forth with each of them. Samuel Shepherd in the 1850, 1860, and 1870 censuses. Same thing with Henry Shepherd, you're down to 1850, 60, 70, 80 censuses. So the rule here is to look at the reality of what you see here on this descendancy and say, well, let's see whether we want to go ahead with this or not. Now, the fact that they're already here in the FamilySearch family tree indicates that some work has been done on every single one of these first people. But the question is, how much work has been done on their children and their descendants? So now we look at an expanded thing. For example, here I'm taking Edward Shepherd, who was, we don't worry about spelling, by the way. They spelled it in a lot of different ways. And we'll see that he lived from 1836 to 1917. He married somebody named Sarah Ring. And then he also married, this is the other one. He apparently also married, no, that was not a second wife. Then he had a sister, Julia Shepherd, and then so forth. Okay, so we're looking at this list. Who are we interested in? Some of these people have already got a lot of information, and some don't have any. So there's 3 situations that we look at on the descendancy chart to see whether or not this is something we want to do, and not just reconfirm that someone else, some work that has already been done. So in this, we show a person who shows a birth date and no death date. So here's a person named Wilbur Clark. He was born in 1864, but it doesn't say when he died. So we have a record perhaps a record that shows that he was a child, but we never show what happened to him. He could have lived 5 minutes, 2 days, a month, a year, 5 years, 10 years, 150 years, 70 years, 80 years. He could have gotten married once, twice, 3 times or more. He could have 1, 2, 15 or 20 or 30 children, depending on how many times he got married. And so Wilbur Clark is a potential person that could add a certain large number of people to the FamilySearch family tree, or to anybody's family tree. What about a couple with no children at all? Between 1865 and 1953 for the wife, and between 1858 and 1935 for the husband, we have plenty of time in there for them to have a family and raise and have grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And so the question is, did they ever have any children? And that's another question that needs to be raised. Now, you'll find that having had a family with children in the 1800s was very much more prevalent than not having any children. As you get closer to the present and into the late 1800s and early 1900s, you may very well find families with only one or two or smaller families. A couple with a few children. So this is another one that's questionable. If they had one child, depending on when they got married, isn't it probable that they had more? Now, this particular situation comes about as a result of people who did their single line ancestors. In other words, they went back on a line until they found, for instance, this person might have been looking on the Stafford line. So Clinton Stafford was his probably great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, and William Stafford was his great-great-grandfather, but they never did the rest of the research. They just did the name line, the surname line back, and didn't bother to pick up all the rest of the children or any of the other relationships that were in there. No second wives, no, nothing like that. Okay, so didn't look like there was a second wife here. It's possible that the Adelia Shepherd could have remarried, but not likely, not in that time period. It is possible if she had been much younger than that and still had children at home, it would have been very possible that she would have remarried. Okay, so these are the three basic formulas for looking at the descendancy to see whether or not it's realistic to really start to dig in and do a lot of research. And you'll find that there is just a never-ending pile of these. So start with one of the people who falls into the three categories. So we're going to start here with Wilbur Clark, and we're going to see what he has. And you'll see that what I thought is probably correct, that there is only one source listed for this person. And so with only one source listed for this person, it is very likely that there is a lot more information about this family that needs to be found. And the fact that he lived from 1864 until deceased means that he could be in the 1870 census as a child. So we would be able to start out finding out if he was in that family by finding the 1870 census, which might be easy and might not be. We have a residence here that shows that he was in 1880. He was in Assumption, a Christian, Illinois, in the United States. And that assumes that gives me a hint that somebody's already attached a record, a census record. So we may have him as a single individual in 1880. That may not be enough information that he is even a descendant of that person. So we've got a lot of research that can be done on this person, and it will be sometimes very productive, we'll call it, of finding more additional information and names of people, but on the other hand, it will not be. So the steps to research are the same with any other person, and you're doing the research. You're not going to change the way you do research because you're doing descendancy than when you're doing ascendancy. It's all going to be the same. And you need to realize you're going to end up with a lot of new relatives, a lot of people out there that you're related to. So here's the key to keeping all of this straight and making sure that you're actually working either way, whether you're looking for your ancestors or you're looking for relatives who are descendants of your ancestors, or whether you're helping someone else with their genealogy, or whatever your involvement and motivation is. The answer here is that you need to focus on the location. Look at the locations. Make sure that they are reasonable and supported by some sort of record. And so, for example, just in this research I was doing today, the person I was looking at was reported right in FamilySearch. It said that he was born in Washington County, Rhode Island. And I could not find a record that showed that he was born in Washington County, Rhode Island. But I did find some census records that shows that he said he was born in Connecticut, or someone said he was born in Connecticut. And so you have to give up that. Just because the information is there in the FamilySearch tree, or there in someone else's ancestry tree, or someone's MyHeritage tree, does not mean it's correct. And when you look at all of the records that you're able to find, you may find that this person really was not born there, that he was born someplace else. A lot of cases, it turns out that I'll start out with a family, descendancy family showing 15 children, and they'll end up with 5, because the other 10 children were born in different times in different places and to different parents. And so it's not necessarily the situation that everything you see on the family tree or on Ancestry or on any of the other websites is going to be defensible or correct. It's somebody could have just copied it or added the names in because they assumed that these people, because they had the same name, last name, were related. And I can assure you, that's one thing I can assure you, that with very few exceptions with European names, for example, and especially in Latin America also, there's no assurance at all because someone has the same surname that they have any relationship to you. Just the other day, I was talking to, I was visiting one of my daughters and her husband's family, and their husband's family was all there. And one of his brother-in-laws said, "Oh, I'm a tanner." And so we pulled out and they always thought he was related because he was a tanner, and because my daughter's a tanner. But we pulled out FamilySearch and we looked at his pedigree on FamilySearch, and he was not related. He was a tanner, that's for sure. But those tanners came directly from England and were not the tanners who settled in Rhode Island in the 1600s. So he was not related at all to me, unless there was some really ancient person back in England, which is not likely to ever be found. So that's kind of the situation we need to be living with. So remember that the descendancy research is the same as ascendancy research, meaning whether you're coming towards the present or going back in the past, you move to the next generation up or down when you have a verifiable parent-child relationship. Until you have that, putting in any kind of a guess is not, let's say it's not allowed by the rules of the game. It's not really, it's nothing but an opinion and is not supportable. And it will not be, no one else who comes along who is trying to verify this information and see whether it's correct will accept just a name. It's not going to happen. So census records are important. You just need to remember the census records. But the idea here is to look for the census record for each member and each and every family member. For each family and each family member in every year that the census is available in the country where you're looking for censuses. And what that means when you translate that to other countries like European countries or Latin America, is you look for the civil registration records and the parish records and all of the other records that are available, the census records for every member of the family. You don't simply put in a list of names from the census and say, okay, we've got those people. No, you go through and detail each one of the people in that group. As you move down, then you have those people, each of those 5 people in the family, the 5 children, you have 5 more family lines as they get married and have children. So you can see how fast this can expand as you're going down through the lines. Okay, and also watch for duplicates, because there is a lot of duplicates left in all of these programs. People often focus on the fact that there's a lot of duplicates in the FamilySearch program. I can, after working for years now in Ancestry, I can say there aren't quite as many. Doesn't seem to show up quite as much in Ancestry, but I am almost consistently looking and finding duplicate records that sneak into my own family tree on Ancestry. So it seems like I will add a family, and then I will find out that I didn't realize I'd already added at least one member of that family in some other way, and I will find duplicates. So duplicates are always a concern. They're always going to be out there, and they will always be part of what we need to work with. And I would encourage you to work systematically through. However you use it, you can use your fan chart to check it off. You can use your pedigree charts to check it off, but that you keep track of the people that you have worked on. And if it's a serious research, if you're not finding anything and you end up doing some, what I would call in the library and in the archives and whatever research, you may want to make sure you keep what's called a research log. That means you let yourself know what you've looked at and what records you still want to look at, so that you can, you have a research plan and a log that will tell you whether you've actually done the work previously. I have no reason, and for the way I do the work, I keep track. I know which work I've done, but I have no problem going back and redoing it, because sometimes when I redo it 2 and 3 times, I find out that I have overlooked putting in a vital place, or I have forgotten to enter a name or a date, and that the records are there, and I need to be going back through and checking to see that the work that I've done is correct. There are some helps out there, and they're specific helps. And here's one of them, the Family History Guide, the fhguide.com, has project number 3, which is under the research, and it will tell you exactly, it give you some additional helps, step-by-step helps of doing descendancy research and how that works out. There's also a significant amount of information in the research wiki. There's videos and handouts, but there's not as much as in the Family History Guide, specifically on descendancy research. But the research wiki is always a premier place to find and have research. As you're going along, you may want to investigate some of the newer innovative research tools. One of those is a program that works with FamilySearch. It's called GoldiMay, and that may be kind of an unusual name, but it's an automatic research log and a set of tools to make your family history work faster and easier. Now, it's been around for quite a while, and it's in the process of being improved, and there'll be some announcements about it at RootsTech. But it is it's a really valuable tool, and it's free, but it's a freemium program, meaning the free version gives you a few tools, and the premium version, which you have to pay something for, is has more tools. But when you get into it, you may find and decide that it's a valuable tool for help. And that's one of the things that you should do. Okay, so one thing I haven't mentioned in depth, and I just kind of mentioned in passing, is DNA testing. When you get into either way, when you're going back in your lines or coming forward, it's helpful if you find that you have DNA matches. Some of one of the most difficult problems that we had in my particular ancestral line was my great-grandfather, who was born in Denmark and was reported in tradition to have been adopted. And there was no real evidence one way or the other. And after years of doing research on that subject off and on, I did find a church record which indicated that he was adopted, but I found no information about his family. And then my daughter, who was interested in that, one of my daughters who was interested, did some research about the families surrounding and found what you would call a good candidate for being this actual person, as a child that was born out of wedlock and then disappears from the census, but appears at almost exactly the same time. But there was nothing really that would tie those together. It was a good hypothesis, it was a good possibility. This fortunately is close enough that we could actually do research. We could actually do DNA research. And because we had already had DNA research done, DNA tests and research in both Ancestry and MyHeritage, we found people who were descendants of the father the father of the child. In Denmark, they identified the father of the child, and even though he was born out of wedlock, and the mother. And that couple, we found descendants direct of that father who matched us in DNA. And because of the DNA matches, that confirmed that this particular connection, this infant that had been adopted, was very highly likely, no longer just probable, but very likely to be the right person. And from that standpoint on, we did more additional research, and it is pretty definite that was who this person was. So that solved a very difficult problem. The limitations on DNA testing, to some extent, is that they're only reliable about 6 or so generations back. So you can't really go back to your 1700 people and expect to have good relationships unless you have certain lines that are direct paternal lines, your father of your father of your father of the father, et cetera, or the mother of the mother of the mother. Some of those can show relationships even further back. So DNA testing is always an option, but as I mentioned previously, it may turn out to be more of a surprise than a help. In some cases, you may find out you're not related to your entire family line and have to start all over again. So you might just remember that when you take a DNA test, that there's kind of a very high possibility element of some surprises. Okay, well, thanks for watching.